Welcome back to Data Science for Everyone. I'm Professor Jones-Rooy. Today, we are continuing our conversation of what makes data good, how do we work with data, how do we evaluate data, and in particular, in this unit, we are going to talk about 4 common errors to look for when you're evaluating a data set. Random errors, systematic errors, errors of validity, and errors of exclusion. Systematic errors are a term I'm mostly using to lump together a number of errors. Sometimes you'll see it talked about as selection bias. And there are types of selection bias, such as response bias, survivor bias, and many others. So random errors. A data set could contain random errors. This is often called noise. We might say we have a noisy data set. There are a lot of random errors in it. These are errors that, on average, in large samples, cancel out over time. Or we might say they are orthogonal to the variables of interest. They do not move in any way associated with the variables of interest. They are often made when collecting the data. So I type in the wrong number when I'm manually entering something. A thermometer isn't perfectly precise. This is how thermometers work. A pedometer that accidentally picks up jostling as a step, mishearing someone in an interview, missing a text when you're collecting from an archive. But there's no reason to assume that we're always mishearing in a certain direction. Every time someone says strongly agree, we always hear strongly disagree, right? Or we're consistently missing texts from a particular part of an archive or something like that. If the thermometer, for example, is consistently slightly too high, or a pedometer is consistently slightly too sensitive, then we're in the land of systematic errors or non-random errors. We're systematically recording a temperature that's higher than reality. We're systematically overcounting how many steps we're taking. Systematic errors are non-random errors. This is when the data we use does not really actually reflect what's going on in the world. So these are values in a data set that differ systematically according to some non-random pattern from our population of interest. This, importantly, will bias our results in a particular direction. Systematic errors do not mean we throw our study away necessarily. We might conclude that we need to if we think the bias is so wild, or we need to adjust our inferences to say we're not really claiming what we think we're claiming. But generally speaking, they are going to bias our results in a particular direction. And in our results, we will say, this is the mean temperature, but many of our thermometers are wrongly slightly high, and so we're overestimating how hot it is. They do not cancel out over time. So if I systematically am overcounting steps, my results are going to make it look like everyone is walking more than they are. Importantly, and often, we want to try to anticipate, maybe predict, maybe work around them, but there's no guarantee. What we want to ask is, if I think there's selection bias or systematic error, how and in what direction would this bias my results? It's not enough to say, this data is biased. This data is biased because we might systematically be overestimating how many steps someone takes in a day. Some common examples. So selection bias are when the values that show up in your study are not random. This could be a sampling problem. For example, I want to predict how people are going to vote in the next election, and I only interview people that I know. I probably know people who agree with me politically, so I'm probably going to overrepresent whatever political view or preference I have. Volunteer-based studies also run into this issue. So if I say, hey, come join this study to see if signing up for green energy improves my mental health because I feel like I'm doing something about climate change. It's a good study. Someone do it. And it's volunteer-based. We're probably going to get a lot of volunteers that already care about the climate. So that's going to affect our inferences. This is why we don't want people to sign up for the treatment versus the control, because folks who are perhaps more desperate for the treatment or more sick are going to sign up for the treatment, and that might mess up our results on the efficacy of the drug. Response bias is a type of selection bias. This is when you manage to get a random sample, but the participants are perhaps predictably not honest. Some examples that I really love in this area are, it turns out if you ask people if they're going to vote in the next election, way more people say they're going to vote in the next election than actually vote in elections. So you might, I'm making up these numbers, but you say, are you going to vote in the next election? 70% of Americans say, oh, yes. And then you look at what percentage of Americans voted in the next election, and it's like 40%. Why? Are people being mean? Are they lying to us on purpose? Maybe. Some of the reasons for response bias include social desirability bias. So if someone says, are you going to vote in the next election? Voting is generally considered a thing we ought to be doing. And so I want this stranger to think that I'm a good person. So I'm going to say, oh, yes, of course. But it also might be the case that I am optimistic about what I'm going to accomplish and say, of course I intend to vote. And then on the day, I'm super busy. I forget. So I'm lying, but not necessarily out of malice. Another great example is when you go to the doctor and they say, well, how often do you exercise? How many drinks do you have in a week? And you overstate how much you're exercising and you understate how many drinks you have in a week. Again, we're not necessarily doing this because we're like, I'm going to trick the doctor. It's probably a little bit of wanting to seem like how often are you flossing, right? We want to seem like we're more on top of our lives than we are. But we also might misremember. We might say, I think I exercise twice a week. But if I actually looked at it, it's like, not quite that. So reasons include, right? Social desirability, pressures, memory. We already know survivor bias. If you watched one of the earlier videos on challenges to causal inference, where we said, hey, if I want to understand what causes someone to live a long time, a challenge with that is that I can only ask people who've lived a long time. So if you're in the study, you're already doing the thing that I'm interested in. And so I'm not really able to fully understand the picture of what's going on. So what do we do about systematic errors? And there's a reason for this image. Bear with me. So one, be on the lookout. Every data set we work with, say, what could be the systematic errors? Is there selection bias? Is there response bias? And so on. We try to minimize these errors the best that we can. For example, something we can do to work around response bias that I think is rather clever, not going to solve all the problems, but survey researchers used to go around to try to understand racism in America by asking people, are you racist? And surprise, surprise, most people said no. But it turns out if you ask people, do you know anyone who's racist? Much more often, you'll get people saying, oh, yeah. So asking people about what other people are doing is one way to maybe steer around response bias. Not guaranteed. That's just one example. Always keep in mind how they're likely to affect your results. If I'm asking people, are you going to vote in the next election? With some certainty, I can say I'm probably overestimating the probability. It's probably a little bit lower than this based on gaps that we've seen in previous elections versus intended and actual outcomes. And we adjust our inferences accordingly. So my survey says 70% of Americans are going to vote in the next election. I would guess it's more like 60. And yes, we're guessing. That's in many cases the best that we can do. Another example, measuring income. So how much money do you make? That's a little bit tricky. Here's our Scrooge, right? So we might start to ask ourselves, okay, if I'm taking to the streets and just asking people I run into, some selection bias there, how much money you earn, would wealthier people be more likely to participate in a survey about income or less likely? Maybe wealthy people, I asked students this, and you can think through some rationale for different directions yourselves, but sometimes students point out that maybe wealthy people have a high income and therefore are very busy and so don't have time to take a survey. Maybe wealthy people love talking about their income because they're very proud of it. Also, being wealthy and having a high income is not necessarily the same thing because you might have wealth from other sources besides your income. By the way, this wonderful painting of Scrooge McDuck, himself very wealthy, is $292,900. So take note. What about if you ask folks from lots of different levels of income, are there certain levels that are more likely to or less likely to overstate or understate their income? So maybe someone who doesn't make a ton of money would overstate it, either because of social desirability bias, because they want me to be impressed by them, or they're ashamed of how much money they make, which is sad that we tie our value to money. Or we think we earn more than we do, right? Maybe I'm estimating tips or something, so I don't really calculate it as rigorously as getting a fixed check every month. And maybe we're missing people whose income is so low, if I'm doing phone calls, don't have a phone. I don't see them when I knock on the door. They're not out and walking around because they have so little money that they're not even like walking around and doing stuff. So there are all these sorts of things to think about. If we have a survey of people with their income, there are many ways that there are going to be biases in these results. And often the best we can do is think very carefully about the probability of those biases. Think about some research design that we could do to get around that. So there's no real easy answer. Yeah, go to employers and just get the information, but there's some privacy issues with that. And by the way, a way to remember response bias. Everybody lies, man. They're all lying. Okay. 2 more errors. Errors of validity. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? So an error of validity is when we think we're measuring one thing. We do our whole research project, we draw conclusions, but no amount of rigorous analysis will help us recover from the fact that we're not actually studying the thing we thought we were studying. This happens a lot. So you want to ask ourselves, when I'm looking at a data set, who am I ruling in and ruling out? So for example, in the last video, we said, suppose we're measuring democracy in terms of elections. We look at the list of countries that we've now labeled as democracies based on the measure that we've developed or the measure that we're reading about. Does this list jive with my general sense of how the world works? Am I ruling in Countries that I think of as not democracies, or any, foreign policy expert would decide is not a democracy, have they ended up in my list? My measure might not be great. Am I ruling out countries that I think are democracies? They're not making the list. You might also say, am I picking up something else entirely? So I might say, yeah, I want the top talent. Okay, how are you going to go about hiring the top talent? Well, we want students who had good grades from high ranking schools. Da, 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 da. I would assert that this does not necessarily reflect talent, and I'm more than happy to have a big old conversation with you about why that is. But there are many ways that you can be a very talented person. I hope it's obvious. There are many ways to be a very talented, wonderful person who would be a great hire, who didn't get great grades and or didn't go to a school that's in the top list of whatever, right? Another example I love, well, it's kind of depressing, but another example that I think is illustrative of this is we do a lot of talk in higher education around standardized tests, the GRE for grad school, the SAT or ACT for undergrad. And the big debate around these, one of the many big debates around these, is, are these actually measuring anything of interest, right? Are they measuring they're meant to measure likely success in college, but maybe we think they're measuring preparation for college. Not quite the same thing. Maybe we think they're measuring how good someone's high school or undergrad program was, but it could be that it's just measuring access to a tutor or access to a type of education that set you up for this sort of test, or maybe just measures test taking skills. So the big debate in all of these, and this is something that's thought about and revisited and studied every which way, and we don't really, really, really know for sure. Finally, this one's tough. We're going to end on a real downer in this video. Errors of exclusion, also known as invisibility bias. This is when we're missing variables or members of a population due to a lack of interest in those variables or members of a population, due to a lack of perceived importance of studying that thing or those people, or a lack of metrics. So we just don't, we think it's important, but we just don't have the numbers because it's tricky. Usually these three are related. There's some really tricky stuff we've learned how to measure because there's money behind it. Usually things we're studying, we humans have had incentives to study those things. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that a lot of things that are really important are not being studied. Often data sets will exclude socially excluded groups. So the Dalit, Romani, incarcerated populations often don't make it into our data sets at all. HIV/AIDS is an excellent and very depressing example of an error of exclusion, where for many, many years, the United States government thought it was not worth investing money in treatments for HIV/AIDS, and a lot of people died because it was seen as not important to study. All economies have informal laborers in the form of domestic work. If you're a stay-at-home parent, you are an informal laborer. And if we want to measure something like GDP, we are in no way including the contributions of those people. And if a country has a lot of informal laborers as a huge part of their labor market, whether they're working at home or out in the world, we're really not picking up the activity in that country's economy. A little bit less depressing, and something I work with companies on, is there are a lot of things that we bring to work that make us effective and valuable for our teams. And many of those are hard to measure, right? We can measure things like number of sales, but it's harder to measure things like makes colleagues feel heard, right? And that could be very, very, very important for the success of your organization. Also in the workplace, there are other things that we cannot study. So I worked with a company once that wanted to understand different dimensions of diversity. They wanted to understand, is there a lot of chronic illness that we don't know about that we could better serve our people by knowing? Are there more religions that we should be acknowledging and giving people time off for? Are there mental health issues among our employees, and are there things we could do to help them? And it turned out we simply could not ask about those things for legal reasons because of the potential for discrimination. So there are lots of reasons that we don't study things. A lot of times, most of the time, almost always, they're very depressing. So what do we do about all these? Well, be aware. Be aware that the data we're looking at is not capital T truth. Evaluate every single data set you work with, that someone presents to you, that someone gives you the results. Anytime you see a table or a graph in the news, I know we don't all have time for this, but click into the source and look at the actual data and evaluate where it was measured and really think about what this is actually reflecting. All right. So evaluate every data set you work with or confront in terms of how it holds up under these four lenses. How and in what direction will these errors influence my results? We almost always don't throw data away unless there's literally no documentation or we're missing, 90%. There's no students often ask like what percentage of missing values do you have to have before you throw data away? There's no fixed number. That's where the instincts come in. That's where practice, that's where exposure to lots of different data sets. It depends on what it is you're trying to study. It depends on how comfortable you are with some uncertainty. So always ask yourself, what are we likely missing? What are some of the biases in here? In what direction will this likely influence my results? Update our conclusions, inferences, policy recommendations accordingly. Be transparent about those limitations. Most of us try to hide the limitations of our data and say, these are my airtight results. No, we did our best to understand performance. We did our best to understand engagement. We did our best to understand homelessness. We did our best to understand the spread of this disease, but it's really, really, really hard to actually measure it and measure it accurately. At minimum, be super skeptical of claims made by others if they are talking about data and they do not acknowledge those limitations. Again, to emphasize, this is the trickiest part, is it's not enough to identify errors. We all like to sit back and be smug and be like, your data is biased. You're missing this. You left out that. Okay, why does that matter? How does it influence my results? Are we overestimating the number of democracies in the world? Are we not quite measuring democracy, but instead we're measuring elections and we need to dig into more about what we mean by democracy? Which is it? What is it that's going wrong? And then how can we improve that and do a better study next? One great thing about science is that it's iterative. And so we don't say, I don't like those results. Let's never study it again. We say, hey, those aren't the strongest results I've ever seen. X, Y, or Z might improve it. Boy, if we talked like that on the internet, wouldn't that be something? All right. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.